What's up, everyone? Today we're going to be talking about Willow Leaf Ficus, one of my favorite tropical species. I don't grow a lot of tropicals, but of the ones that I do grow, these I find to be really great to work with. But first, I just want to say that this channel is largely supported by those of you who purchase plants from Bonsaify.com or other merchandise. You can check out bonsai.com. We have these Willow Leaf Ficus starters for sale. And if you want to pick one up, we ship throughout the United States. Unfortunately, we do not ship internationally. My first exposure to Willow Leaf Ficus was when my teacher about 12 years ago handed me a few cuttings and said, "Here, give this a try and see how you like it." And ever since then, I've been growing this plant. And it started off looking pretty much just like this one when it was young, and ever since then I have been alternating between growing it out and cutting it back. Some of the properties of Willow Leaf Ficus that I really like are that they seemingly on their own make really good nebari, and you can see that this one has some really nice roots on it. Let me give it a spin here. There's a big cut back here because they actually make such large nebari that it's difficult to get them into small pots if you are not thinking of that in advance. And that's one of the things that we're going to talk about today. So spinning this back around, when I see Willow Leaf Ficus that people have grown, they're often just some interesting roots like this and then rapidly tapering to a relatively straight stick and then a bunch of branches. So let's take a look at how we can make a small tree like this. I picked this out of a flat of our starters and I'm going to pull it out of the container. I've let these dry out for a couple of days because it's very wet and rainy right now. And that makes the root work a little bit easier. But what I'm looking for here is that oftentimes with these guys, the base of the trunk, in other words, where the nebari start, is swollen quite a bit. And so you can look at the size of this portion of the trunk and you think, oh, that's not a very big tree, or it doesn't have much to it. And then when you get down into the pot, you find that there are all of these roots in here. So I'm going to go through and kind of clean up this one, and then I'm going to grab a couple more examples and clean those up so we can look at how to deal with the large roots. Let's start with this one. Hopefully this is enough of them to be a representative example. So the roots on this are actually relatively small and there's not a lot of them. And one of the things I've found is that these guys seem to like a little bit more organic matter in their soil than what I use on a lot of my other plants that I'm propagating and growing out. So I would recommend that you, if you're familiar with my soil components, you would increase the percentage of coco coir, maybe up to even something like 40 or 50%. And I think the perlite is fine, but I'm finding that they make more fine roots in the portion of the soil that contains more of the coco coir. So for this one, it didn't have any really large roots, so I've just kind of trimmed those back into a disc, and I'm going to go ahead and stick this back in the container. I'll set it aside for now. I guess this one's kind of potentially a lot more interesting in terms of the discussion that or what I want to point out in this video. So I'm going to cut off some of these branches that are all coming out of here. They have, where they're cut back, they have the tendency to basically just create a large cluster of branches. And just with many, like with many other species, it's a good idea to thin down clusters to just one or two so as to prevent reverse taper and other problems. So this is starting to create a bulge here. So I'm going to take off one of these two trunks and kind of make the other one the actual trunk while I sort of encourage it to make branching. And you can see that the trunk has kind of cleared itself out of branching down low. Part of that is because these are nested together in flats, but it's not to worry with this type of plant, because as soon as I cut it back, it's liable to send out more shoots, especially if I cut the whole thing back. Now, the top's not nearly as complicated in this case as the bottom, and you can see that this has roots, multiple roots that are actually larger than what they junction with into the trunk. I find this to be really interesting, although potentially frustrating, characteristic of this species. So in order to deal with it and to make sure that you can actually fit these into small containers, what I'm going to do is I'm literally going to come in here and cut off almost the entirety of the largest roots. You might think that that is going to be problematic, but generally speaking, it is not going to be problematic with this species. It seems like they have the ability to essentially store large amounts of starch and resources in these roots, which is why they swell up like that. But in order for us to make a good bonsai out of this, we can't have large untapering roots that are projecting straight out from the trunk. We need to cut those back and encourage it to make more fine roots. So it's largely the same treatment as the one that had smaller roots, but it seems a lot more dramatic when you look at it from start to finish. Let me go through the rest of these. So in this case, I actually took off a few of the higher roots in favor of just leaving this one sort of circular band of roots, and that will ultimately provide a better looking nebari. And as you can see, I've cut off basically 97% of the roots. As you might imagine, these are really relatively easy to root as cuttings, and so we can use that to our advantage essentially to improve the rooting on trees that are already growing like these by not being nervous about cutting off large roots, because essentially you're not really making a cutting because it already has roots, but you are removing a lot of the rooting that it's already created, although because there's already root tissue here, it's not going to take the plant nearly as long to issue new roots. So here we are back at the first one, and it's almost like you want to follow the principle that the larger the roots are, the further you want to cut them back. So this giant root here, I'm going to cut pretty much back, all the way back to the base of the tree. And this, I'm going to go around and basically do the same thing to the others. And in this case, I also don't want this many low shoots, so I'll just leave one of these. All right, so you might be thinking to yourself, that's ridiculous. But these guys are, so if it's cold, you can keep them inside. That's one of the great things about this as a species. So if you live in a northern climate, you can grow them under grow lights all winter. If you live in a southern climate, you could grow them under grow lights during the winter, and then just put them outside as soon as your danger of frost is gone. I'm going to pot 2 of these into some of my cement bonsai containers that I have here. And I'm going to pick the 2 that have sort of the largest base to them. And I've added a little bit of a akadama mixture to the pot here to nestle it onto the top. And then I'm going to use these tie wires in order to basically tie the tree into the pot. With both these guys tied into the pot, I'm just going to add a little bit of soil here, and they might be potted a little bit deep for a finished bonsai at the moment because I'm not showing much of the nebari, but I can always do that next time I repot. 2 trees repotted. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, those look fine, or you might be thinking to yourself, well, those don't look really that interesting. And if you're thinking the latter, I would agree with you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut these guys way back. And by way back, I mean a lot back. Now, they've been wired, but the wiring curves are a little bit too loose for my taste. So I'm actually going to cut this here and this here. And this is partly to demonstrate that cutting back these guys when you're starting to actually train them like bonsai is what you have to do in order to not end up with a leggy plant like this. So because this one has some interesting movement to it up to about this point, I'm going to go ahead and cut it there. And that will focus the energy of the tree and the aesthetics onto the interesting part rather than the straight stick that's above it. And that's really what I'm after when I'm creating small compositions like this. I'm going to take the rest of these and do the same thing, but let's move on to a couple that I have in 1-gallon cans. As you can see, these guys are significantly bigger, but I'm expecting to find kind of the same thing, and there are some differences. This one in particular is kind of interesting because it looks like it's been bent over almost like a raft. So let's dig into, I actually have 4 of them here. So let's dig into these and see what we find. The principles I'm working on with these 1-gallon cans are exactly the same as what I was working on with the ones that were in 3-inch containers. Everything's just a little bit bigger. So I am starting by trying to even out the root base, and in this case there's a root kind of twisting up here, so I'm going to cut that off. And as I kind of excavate down here, what looked like a tree that had maybe a 1/2-inch base actually turns out to be about 1.5 inch base, which is one of the things that I think makes these guys so exciting to work with. But I have to go through the same kind of exercise that I did with the smaller ones, and that is removing some of the big roots, because if I don't remove these big roots, then I won't be able to get it into a small bonsai pot. So taking the largest ones, kind of excavating around them to see what's going on. And I'm going to cut back the little ones as well. Just like the others, I'm also going to be trimming back the top hard. So rather than keep you in suspense, I'm going to just, so one of the things I'm looking at is the angle of the trunk. I think this side's a little bit nicer, and creating more movement through pruning off the parts that are straight is part of what we can do. So if I make that the trunk, don't need this branch on the underside, and then make that the next section, now I have the beginnings of a really nice little bonsai. Now that I've got this kind of trimmed back to stubs in terms of the large roots at least, I can kind of better evaluate what's going on. Actually, this needs to come off. So with the large scars, if I bury this, these guys are going to issue new roots. If I don't bury it, they'll start to callus over. And these guys, they're not fantastic at callousing large cuts, especially up in here, but I'm going to have to actually kind of experiment a little bit more. So just to kind of finish where I'm headed with this, I'm going to go ahead and cut off this top part. Now, if you want a larger tree or a less stumpy looking tree, you don't have to cut back this hard. But if you want to build taper like I showed you in the example at the beginning of the video, then it's a really good idea to do this kind of heavy cutback. So this is where I ended up. I've got 4 of these guys that have all been cut back pretty severely, I guess. I'm going to put these in pretty small containers because at this point the trunks are about as big as I want, and I can just sort of move into creating nice little branches and nice little crowns like we saw in the example at the beginning. All right, so that's 6 examples, counting the littler ones, of cutting back and potting down these Willow Leaf Ficus. And in terms of care, after doing this, I'm going to be keeping these in my greenhouse. But you don't need a greenhouse in order to grow these. In fact, they make actually pretty good indoor plants. You want to keep them in a warm place and make sure that they have plenty of light, so you can use window light as long as that's not keeping them too cold because of proximity to cold windows. And then they can be grown outdoors as long as it's not going to freeze. Definitely don't want to let them freeze. They'll just turn into basically something like slimy lettuce. Thanks everyone for watching. If you want to pick up one of those 3-inch starters of these Willow Leaf Ficus, you can find it on Bonsaify.com. Hope you enjoyed that. We'll see you next time.